Like with the last episode, this one too was triggered by a headline that I saw and which intrigued me. India fears losing out to China in smartphone exports race. This Reuters piece cited Minister of State for IT, Mr. Rajeev Chandrasekhar's letter dated January 3rd to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman expressing anxiety that India's high tariffs are actually a deterrent to investments that could help bolster our exports. Is India struggling to attract such investments? Let's take a look at what competitors, albeit smaller than India, like Vietnam, have done right in the space and what India could come up to speed and hopefully in double quick time. Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. Mr. Chandrasekhar's letter to his colleague in the government emphasizes the need to cut down on tariffs for India. Lobbies for Apple and other electronic giants have pointed out that our tariffs are high and that countries like China and Vietnam are actually more attractive for them. Given all the geopolitical tensions between US and China, companies in the West are trying to move their supply chains away from China, if not entirely, at least partially. And given these trends, countries such as Vietnam and others in Asia, such as Philippines, Indonesia, maybe even Thailand, could stand to benefit and they're poised to take a big chunk out of that pie. While India, despite its aspirations, has lagged so far. And going back to that letter that Mr. Chandrasekhar wrote to the finance minister, he says, the geopolitical realignment is forcing supply chains to shift out of China. We must act now or they will shift to Vietnam, Mexico, and Thailand. And sure enough, the winds of change are showing up in statistics. In the year that just passed, 2023, the US imported more from Mexico than it did from China. And this is the first in about 20 years. India would have loved to have been the one to topple China, but it did not. US Ambassador to India Eric Garcetti is recently reported to have said that investments were not flowing into India, but into Vietnam because India's tariffs are pretty high, especially on input materials. In other words, input materials are those that go into making, like raw materials that go into making a whole product. And his comment is telling. He says, if you tax inputs, you're not protecting a market. What you're doing is limiting a market. So what can India do to outpace rivals such as Vietnam? After all, India has taken some steps around taxation and incentives and so on. Specifically, in 2019, India announced a flat rate of 15% tax for all new manufacturing units announced for the country. And India's performance-linked incentive scheme has done really well for mobile phones and electronics, but not as much for several of the remaining 13 sectors for which this scheme was applicable. In a recent article, Biswajit Dhar, distinguished professor at the Center for Social Development, said that the original intent of the PLI scheme was to raise the share of manufacturing to the gross value added in the country from about 16% in fiscal year 2015 to about 25% by 2022. But he points out, instead, the share of that sector has now fallen below 15%. In his piece, we read, industrial policy was successfully implemented in the East Asian region because the governments there used a combination of policies to accumulate physical and human capital, allocate this capital to highly productive investments, and acquire and master technology to achieve rapid productivity growth. So we spoke to Professor Dhar to understand what these countries have actually done right. What emerged in that conversation was that China and the China model, replicated by the likes of Vietnam, have focused on a few key or critical issues. One was the development of physical infrastructure. The example is of SEZs, the Special Economic Zones. So in countries such as China, everything is ready for companies to just come in, plug and play, and start making money. The second is the development of human resources and associated skills. There, India does lag a bit. Then comes development of the ecosystem. So railway and port connectivity and the turnaround time in ports and so on. And finally, labor laws that equally protect human rights as well as protect the interests of companies that come in and invest. So let's hear what Professor Dhar has to say, elaborating on these points. Hello, Professor Dhar. To begin with, how well do you think India has done in terms of attracting investments?
I think there are there are several problems there. You mentioned about the incentives that the government has given, and and the PLI is also offering substantial incentives as well. Those 14 sectors, identified sectors. But like you said, except I think mobile phones, the performance, the PLI hasn't actually done as well as we expected it. I recently wrote a long article and analyzed the whole PLI scheme, and I must say I was very disappointed to see the performance, because I think this was one scheme that we were expecting, we had high expectations of, and we thought that, for the first time, the government has actually put the nuts and bolts together for the revival of the manufacturing sector. The problem is that I think there are certain basic things about an industrial policy that needs to be kept in mind, and the policymakers haven't done that in when they're designing the PLI. The first thing is that you don't get an industrial policy getting off the ground or taking off without an innovation policy, put together. Because in today's world, when technologies are moving so fast, you can't be saying that I'm going to be setting up a manufacturing facility today, and that's going to serve me for the next 10 years. No, that's not going to happen. Yeah? And I've got a technology, and I'll put it, look for 10 years. There has to be constant sort of upgrading, and we all know this. This is the truism, the world we live in today, and we have to do that. Now, we haven't actually done that. We haven't actually been able to do that. The second is that the name of the game, and China has taught us this, is scale economies. Yeah. So you can't actually have these manufacturing capacities spread over a large number of companies, small companies. The MSMEs can do the backup in terms of providing certain intermediates and all that. But upfront, when you're talking about, say, any sector that you think of, you need scales. And I always say that the magic of scale economy is something that we studied only in the textbooks. But what it could be in reality is what China has shown us. Yeah, so I think when the government went out and looked for potential candidates to implement the PLI scheme, and here I'm going to be dwelling on the PLI scheme for the moment, then that should have been kept in mind. You should have seen who can deliver, because again, industrial policy is about picking winners. And the third thing is that you can't be too nosy. Yeah, like you said, that ease of doing business. The government can't be too nosy. Yeah? And what it seems by looking at the PLI scheme, that in many ways we are getting back to the license control, Raj. Yeah, because the government is telling the producers how much to produce for getting what kind of incentive, and then this incentive level goes up as you produce more. Now, all that means that there is going to be an inspector. So inspector comes in and says, "Oh, you produced this much, I'll give you this much." Yeah, and then so here I would actually try to move into what Vietnam did. There doesn't seem to be any sort of clear vision as to what these manufacturers, the new manufacturers, are going to be doing. Are they going to be producing for the domestic market, or exports, or both? Yeah. Now, given the the period in which PLI scheme was announced, that was, you remember, the rhetoric was vocal for local, Atmanirbhar. Yeah. So it was actually set in this tone that we are too dependent on China, and we are now going to be producing everything here. Yeah. And now the moment you do that, you go back to the earlier era of import substitution. Yeah. Then you start thinking only in terms of a closed economy framework. You don't give importance to the export markets. Now, that's the big difference between India and Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, as you know, is a super exporting economy. Yeah? Is completely export oriented, and after China, I would say this is the country which is actually sort of imitated exactly what China did, and became really focused on the export market, and and did everything that is required to put the manufacturing sector on a sustainable and a growing pathway. Again, the difference between India and China, they developed all the right kinds of skills that are required for really allowing a manufacturing sector to take off. So in terms of the skill sets available in Vietnam, they're highly skilled. Yeah, and again, this is a very similar story as like China, and they're able to utilize that skill.
Professor Dhar, in the PLI scheme, after all mandates companies that they should have a certain level of production if they want a certain level of incentive and so on. So, should the scheme itself have mandated companies to start developing human resources skills themselves? Because we've done this with IT services companies over the last 20-25 years. That sector has taken just raw graduates out of college and trained them, and in 6 months' time they become billable. Do you think this is something that was feasible with PLI?
The foreign investors are mandated to make money. So their shareholders are having asked them to actually get as much of profits as possible. That's it. So they will cut costs and they will try to maximize, and that's a rational commercial firm. That's how they do it. So when the governments had come and told us that, look, foreign companies are going to be investing in infrastructure, foreign companies are going to be creating skills. Yeah, so you're barking up the wrong tree. Yeah. So these are the things the government is supposed to be doing, like China did. So China built the infrastructure, and that's exactly what the Vietnamese are doing. Yeah. Build the entire infrastructure and conveyed a very clear message to them. Look, you just have to come in here, start producing and make your money. Yeah. And China, as we all know, have this special economic zones where it is plug and play. Yeah. Everything is there. Went to one of the special economic zones in near Beijing. So even workers' dormitories were built by the government. And then what happens is that when the investor is interested, and like this special economic zone has a port like Tianjin, about 150 miles away, and then there is this that fast train which covers 50 kilometers in 30 minutes. Yeah, so all that is there. So when the investors are coming in, of course, they've been lured, then the government can negotiate. Yeah. And they have negotiated all kinds of things. Yeah. Including tech transfer. Yeah. And making Chinese companies work with these big multinationals and sitting there and sponging their technology. That's the thing. Now, on each count, India is actually falling behind. Now, for instance, we had this SEZ policy in 2005. Yeah. And what was, if you look at the policy, it was said that we're going to provide world-class infrastructure. And one of the things, so maybe, there are few studies which showed there was some infrastructure. But what you had mentioned in between, that, the road from wherever for the Prime Minister to go and inaugurate, the road was non-existent. So what has happened that SEZs have the infrastructure, but from the SEZ to the port, there is nothing. Yeah. So it makes it unattractive. So when the SEZ policy was announced, they were, the number of SEZs which are registered and all were, I think, 450 plus. And how many are functioning? Hardly, properly, I would say. So I think what has happened is that once you miss this whole thing about being export oriented, that you have a market where you have competition, and they have discerning consumers will not take a substandard product. So if if the government can't talk to the business, because the business is still not, because business is very happy that they have this large internal market. Yeah, even 150 million middle class is a market they're not going to get anywhere in the world except China. Yeah. So fine, I'm going to make it, we're going to invest, produce whatever, and sell it to the domestic consumers. I don't have to do anything in terms of looking at the export market. Now, I think this is the problem, that country which was completely devastated, ravaged in the 60s and started in the 70s, in a short period of time is way ahead of India in terms of a destination for foreign investors.
So, Professor Dhar, with regard to Vietnam's FTAs or free trade agreements, it has numerous agreements with economic blocs or specific individual countries. India does too. But do you think the choice of FTAs that it has, or the number that Vietnam has, do you think that has helped Vietnam sort of outpace everybody else in the region?
If you see in terms of the major FTAs, then we have three FTAs, the major ones: ASEAN, Japan, Korea. Yeah, the UAE thing, it's not a kind of a, you're doing that it with an entrepot, doesn't really matter that much. Australian FTA is a early harvest, so it's not a full FTA. And as compared to that, the number for Vietnam is 16, and they are negotiating with EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, Switzerland and Liechtenstein and all. Now, and then they are into these. The 16 include RCEP, from which we came out, CPTPP, which is the pre-TPP, the minus the US, and of course the free trade agreement with the European Union. Yeah. Vietnam is actually benefiting from all these FTAs. Yeah. Now, one other thing I must say is that when the TPP negotiations were taking place, the US had actually imposed a very strong, very I thought stringent condition on the Vietnamese, that they have to reform their labor laws. Yeah. And they have to bring the labor laws in conformity with the ILO conventions. All those. Now, as you know, we have not ratified two critical ILO conventions, and the government is going on the other side. And my my understanding is that our FTA with European Union is going to fail on this count, because the European Union will not accept any FTA without a labor clause. Yeah. Now, if you look at so there is this hesitation or reluctance on the part of the government to give the workers their due. Yeah. And today, if India has to participate in the global value chains, there is something called due diligence, which has been pushed by the OECD, by the European Union, and all along the value chains, they ensure that there is human rights are ensured, labor rights are protected to the full extent. You can't have it otherwise. Yeah. But I don't really understand, why we just want to look the other way. Yeah. Because here is a country like Vietnam with its socialist past and all those kinds of issues. They transformed the labor market. Yeah. And participated in FTAs, and they do it very willingly, and they do it very proactively, and they don't have a problem. Yeah. And they are actually their workforce is progressing. Yeah. So in terms of scales and everything, they're progressing. So so there is no problem, and we are completely on the other side. We don't want to give workers rights. We are resistant to signing FTAs because we know that our industries are going to be completely decimated.
But isn't India's stand such that it wants to protect the rights of these laborers and workers? After all, it says companies shouldn't come here and be able to hire and fire and so on.
No, because see what we are doing is that we are actually going in for flexible labor markets. Yeah, and the workers' rights are actually being truncated. This is the problem with the labor codes coming in. This is exactly what is happening, because this is what the industry wants. Because the industry in India, the businesses in India are surviving on the entire wage arbitrage. So they keep on pushing the wages down to the extent that now we have reached the rock bottom. And what has happened is that because we are doing this, I'll just take it 1 minute. The domestic demand has gone for a toss because people don't have any money in their hands. So now we're going to do a vicious cycle because there is no demand. Private investment is not coming in. Yeah. So the government is talking about crowding in private investment, which Nirmala Sitharaman did, has been doing repeatedly. But private sector, year after year, you guys have been reporting, is actually coming down. It's not happening because investors are not going to put money if they can't sell their wares. Simple as that.
So those areas are, in a nutshell, areas that India has to work on and quickly solve. That brings us to the end of this episode, but don't go away. We still have our Did You Know section and the quiz part. Did you know that exports accounted for only 25% of India's smartphone production, worth $44 billion last year, compared with 63% of China's $270 billion worth and 95% of Vietnam's $40 billion worth of production? And here we have for you the answer to last week's quiz question. Why do countries prefer a small or a healthy level of inflation rather than deflation? A healthy level of inflation makes people want to buy or spend more. So there's consumption in the fear that, sometimes I'd rather buy now than later when prices go up. So the anticipation of prices going up. So that creates a virtuous cycle. When you buy more, companies tend to manufacture more or offer more services, which means creation of more jobs and so on. Of course, if there is runaway inflation, then people say, I don't want to spend. I don't have money to spend as time goes by, right? So you don't want that. Deflation, on the other hand, creates a vicious cycle. If there is deflation and I as a citizen know or anticipate that prices will keep falling, so I will hold off on purchases. I won't spend now in the anticipation that I can buy cheaper later. So where that cycle will take us is as people spend less and less, companies won't have enough sales. So they will invest less and less in manufacturing or offering of services, which means they will create lesser jobs. And that impacts economic growth profoundly. So that brings us to the quiz question for this week. And to stay in tune with today's topic, the question is, why would countries aspire to become exporting giants? If you have a large enough economy like India, we can say companies, foreign investors come here, invest, provide products and offer services for the local market and be done with it. Why are exports so important? Leave us your comments in the section below. We'd love to hear from you. And that's all we have for you this week. Before you go away, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And till we meet again, have a lovely time ahead.